Welcome to the debate. Imagine you walk into the lobby of a beautifully designed, state-of-the-art corporate headquarters.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. We are talking marble floors, floor-to-ceiling glass walls, just absolute architectural perfection. But right in the middle of that pristine, multi-million-dollar floor, there is a cheap orange plastic bucket.
Oh, catching a leak from the ceiling, right?
Exactly. Catching a slow, steady drip of water. Now, when you see that, you don't declare war on the bucket, do you?
No, obviously not.
Right. You don't launch some enterprise-wide initiative to replace the orange bucket with a sleeker, enterprise-grade titanium bucket. You look up and you fix the roof.
Because the bucket is just doing its job. I mean, it's diagnosing the leak.
Precisely. The bucket is a symptom. And, in a high-stakes world of enterprise finance, Microsoft Excel is that orange bucket.
Yeah, that is a very familiar bucket for a lot of people.
It really is. If you're a CFO tuning into this, you are probably thinking about the tens of millions of dollars you just spent on a massive ERP upgrade. An upgrade that was, supposed to kill Excel once and for all.
And yet it never does.
Never. You are probably wondering why your controllers are still downloading CSV files every Friday night just to close the books. So today, we are looking at the gritty realities of finance transformation, drawing on material that really forces us to examine why global financial institutions are still fundamentally reliant on spreadsheets.
Right. We're really digging into that core tension. Is the solution to Excel dependency fundamentally a matter of building a new technological architecture like canonical data models and orchestration layers?
Exactly. Or, on the flip side, is it primarily a challenge of capturing tacit process knowledge and retraining human governance?
Which really gets to the heart of why so many digital transformation projects fail. I mean, we spend billions on software, but the spreadsheets, they never actually leave the building.
Exactly. So I'll just lay my cards on the table right here. My position is that Excel is simply a diagnostic symptom of missing structural architecture.
Okay, so a purely structural issue then.
Yes, structural. The only true cure is building a foundational triad of canonical data models, data orchestration, and configurable compliance. The gap keeping us tied to spreadsheets is fundamentally technological.
Right. Well, and my position is that while architecture is certainly important, we all want a good roof. Focusing purely on technology ignores the reality of the business.
How so?
Because Excel houses the organization's institutional memory. It performs essential, highly nuanced manual data cleaning. Without prioritizing human capability, human judgment, and that tacit knowledge, any architectural overhaul will inevitably fail. I don't care how much you spend on it.
Well, let's dive into that because the source material makes a really profound point right out of the gate. It says treating Excel as the villain of finance transformation is a massive framing error.
Yeah, it didn't just sneak in overnight.
Exactly. Excel didn't infiltrate enterprise finance by accident. It wasn't some localized failure of governance where employees just, rebelled against management.
No, they were trying to do their jobs.
Right. It filled a very specific, cavernous structural gap between what highly rigid enterprise systems were designed to do and what the business actually requires on a day-to-day basis.
Right, the reality on the ground.
Yeah. Think about an ERP, an enterprise resource planning system. ERPs are fantastic at structured, heavily defined, immutable processes, like core ledger accounting.
Sure, they lock things down.
But they are notoriously rigid. So when a controller needs a specific regulatory format that the ERP doesn't natively generate, they can't just call up the local tax authority and say, sorry, our system doesn't do that.
Right, the deadline is a deadline. The regulator absolutely does not care about your software limitations.
No, they don't. So the finance team has to adapt the tool to fit the process, which usually means dumping the data out of that rigid system and manipulating it manually. And that is exactly where Excel becomes the universal adapter. It is an infinite, flexible canvas.
It really is.
But here's the critical thesis of their architectural argument. The only way to genuinely make Excel obsolete is through 3 strict architectural conditions.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, you need a canonical data model for consolidation. Second, you need real-time data availability through a data orchestration layer to end that manual extraction.
Right.
And third, you need configurable compliance tools. If you just take a messy Excel process and move it to a specialized, purpose-built software tool without fixing the underlying data architecture, you have solved absolutely nothing. You've just bought the titanium bucket.
Well, I'm completely with you on the titanium bucket. I mean, migrating a broken process from a spreadsheet to a slick new cloud software interface is what the material explicitly caused the most successful failure in enterprise technology.
The most successful failure? Yeah.
You get a nice dashboard, sure, but the process is still fundamentally broken. But treating this strictly as a technological deficiency is exactly why these massive Excel elimination programs consistently fail.
You think it's more than technology?
Oh, absolutely. If we look at the materials analysis of why these programs collapse, it points directly to the human element and, the incredibly messy reality of enterprise data.
Okay, well, I want to hear how you interpret that messy reality. Because from an architectural standpoint, the fix seems incredibly clear to me.
Well, let's look at what is actually happening inside those spreadsheets. The most dangerous, operationally critical Excel files in any large organization contain deep, tacit knowledge.
Tacit knowledge, meaning?
We are talking about complex nested formulas, massive macro-driven adjustments, and completely bespoke exception handling rules. These spreadsheets act as the informal institutional memory of the entire finance function.
I mean, true, but they shouldn't.
But they do. And furthermore, the current state of Excel in most companies is actually functioning as a manual data cleaning mechanism. The enterprise data coming out of those multi-million-dollar ERPs simply isn't clean enough to be automated.
Because the data models don't align.
Well, fields are missing. Classifications completely differ between regions. Therefore, the absolute priority must be addressing the human capability to govern whatever replaces Excel, capturing that embedded logic, rather than just deploying a shiny new data model and expecting the software to magically fix human input errors.
Let's actually test that, because this is where our two perspectives really collide. We both agree Excel is papering over a gap.
Right.
But we disagree on what that gap fundamentally looks like at the data level. From an architectural standpoint, the text gives us very specific use cases, like consolidation.
Okay.
Excel-based consolidation exists primarily because of misaligned data models. You have an entity in France using euros and a certain local accounting treatment.
Yeah, and an entity in the US using dollars in another.
Exactly. Their charts of accounts look totally different. A canonical data model fixes this by acting like a universal translator at the United Nations.
A universal translator?
Yes. Instead of subsidiary A speaking vendor code 123 and subsidiary B speaking supplier ID 456, the model forces everyone to speak one unified data language before it even hits the consolidation system.
Right. In theory.
It enforces semantic alignment automatically. If you're reconciling in Excel, it just means your systems aren't connected, which is why you need a data orchestration layer, essentially the digital plumbing, to automatically route and match that data.
I come at it from a different way. Let's play out your perfect scenario.
Sure.
Let's say you build that universal translator and lay down perfect digital plumbing. You're assuming the inputs fed into that plumbing are pristine.
Well,
But the text explicitly states that automated tools built on inconsistent data just produce inconsistent outputs. Think about it.
okay.
Building a canonical data model without addressing human data entry behavior is like building a state-of-the-art water purification plant, but letting people dump mud directly into the pipes upstream.
Mud in the pipes? Okay.
The machinery might work perfectly according to its design, but it is just going to efficiently pump out muddy water.
Right, but
If your flawless orchestration layer pulls from an ERP where the local clerk forgot to enter a vendor code or classified a software expense as office supplies because they were rushing, your canonical model fails.
does it fail though?
Yes, the orchestration layer just orchestrates bad data faster. This leads right back to the controller looking at the final output, realizing it's wrong, exporting it into Excel, and manually fixing it. The spreadsheet is doing data cleaning because the human being running it actually knows the quirks of the source systems.
Right, but doesn't the sheer act of deploying a canonical data model force the master data governance that fixes the quality issue at its root?
How so?
Well, you literally cannot turn the new system on or map the architecture until you rationalize the chart of accounts. The architecture itself acts as a forcing function. It rejects the muddy water at the source.
You think the software just stops the mud?
Yes. If a system structurally prevents a user in a subsidiary from leaving a critical field blank, that solves the human behavior problem through system design.
That is a very dangerous assumption, and honestly, one that has doomed countless transformation projects.
Why is it dangerous? It's standard validation.
Because you are assuming that deploying technology automatically dictates human compliance. But rationalizing a chart of accounts across a global enterprise isn't a software deployment. It's a massive, bruising political and behavioral negotiation.
Well, sure, it's not easy.
When you say the architecture forces governance, what actually happens in the real world is that the project timeline gets tight, the budget starts running over, and aligning master data across 70 countries proves too difficult.
So they compromise.
Exactly. The integration team just compromises. They map the messy, muddy data into the new canonical model with a bunch of temporary Band-Aid rules to make the go-live date.
Yeah, I've seen that happen.
Right. And because the data is still dirty at the point of entry, the automated output is untrustworthy. And what happens next? The finance team loses faith in the system immediately.
And they go back to Excel.
They download the data into Excel and start doing their manual adjustments all over again. The underlying issue is that the text identifies data quality as a distinct, standalone reason for failure, entirely separate from the architectural gap.
I have to admit, I've seen that exact scenario play out with integration teams rushing to hit a deadline. But I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because even if we assume you get the data clean, I want to challenge this idea of institutional memory.
Okay, challenge away.
You're defending these massive, complex spreadsheets, but relying on tacit knowledge hidden in an undocumented macro, say a macro that Bob in accounting built 8 years ago, is a massive financial reporting risk.
Well, nobody loves Bob's macro.
Right. It is the absolute definition of formula fragility. The text points out that Excel was designed for individual desktop analysis, not as enterprise-grade infrastructure.
True.
Having your critical compliance logic trapped in Bob's mind or buried in a VLOOKUP that completely breaks if someone accidentally inserts a new row is just unacceptable governance.
Look, Bob's macro isn't a feature we actively want, but you have to understand why it exists in the first place.
To fill a gap.
Yes. You deploy your new architecture, and the implementation team comes in. They look at Bob's spreadsheet, they look at the final number it produces, and they work backward to replicate that output in the new system.
Which makes sense.
But they don't fundamentally understand the complex exception handling rules built into that macro over years of trial, error, and painful regulatory audits.
But they don't need to.
They absolutely do. The spreadsheet is often the only place where the actual real-world logic of a highly specific business process is recorded. You wipe out a decade of institutional memory overnight just to have a cleaner IT landscape.
But walk me through how the new architecture fails to capture that. Because the third pillar of the solution is a configurable compliance platform.
Right. The shiny new compliance tool.
The entire goal of that software is to render Bob's convoluted custom exception rules completely unnecessary. It subscribes to global regulatory updates automatically and maps the canonical data directly to the required formats.
Again, in theory.
The custom rules in Bob's spreadsheet only exist because the old system couldn't handle the translation between the raw data and the localized regulatory requirement. If the platform handles the formatting automatically, the finance professional just configures the submission.
Okay, but
We shouldn't be trying to meticulously capture Bob's labyrinth of tacit knowledge. We should be eliminating the environment that made his labyrinth necessary in the first place.
that sounds beautiful in a textbook. Really, it does. But the real world is not perfectly configurable. The text explicitly warns against underestimating this embedded logic, because enterprise finance lives and dies in the 10% of exceptions that generic software simply can't handle.
But the software isn't generic, it's configurable.
Let's think about a highly complex intercompany tax provision required by a very specific local jurisdiction in South America. Software vendors design their configurable platforms for the standard use cases.
Mostly, yes.
But the tacit knowledge inside Bob's macro isn't just how to format the report, it's how to legally interpret this highly specific, ambiguous regulatory requirement given our unique corporate structure.
Okay, that's fair.
A configurable platform doesn't make that judgment call.
a piece of software cannot interpret legal ambiguity. A highly trained human being does. If you don't formalize that logic and map the human expertise into the new system, your shiny new tool just produces a very clean, very fast, highly formatted, incorrect number.
But isn't that exactly why the architecture is the prerequisite?
How do you figure?
By stripping away the 90% of manual work, the frantic data gathering, the endless formatting, the Friday night consolidation panic, the architecture liberates the human intellect.
Liberates it.
Yes. Once the digital plumbing is moving the data automatically, the finance professional is finally freed up to focus strictly on those subjective legal judgment calls in those 10% edge cases. We move consolidation from a brute force data alignment exercise to a highly strategic analytical exercise.
But that shift requires a massive upgrade in human capability, which, by the way, the text calls out as a primary reason elimination programs fail.
Because they don't train the staff?
Exactly. When you automate the brute force work, the deep tacit expertise of your finance professionals has to be completely redirected. They must shift from manually executing the process to governing an automated system, managing those edge cases, and validating the machine's outputs.
Right, which is a higher value task.
Yes, but if the organization does not invest heavily in developing this new governance capability alongside the software deployment, they lose Bob's manual expertise without gaining any new governance capability. You just end up with an unmonitored black box making millions of dollars worth of automated decisions.
Which brings us perfectly to the external urgency of all of this. Because we aren't just having a theoretical debate about making Bob's life easier anymore.
No, we definitely aren't.
We have to talk about CTCs, continuous transaction controls. The source material highlights this as the ultimate external forcing function.
The regulatory landscape is fundamentally shifting beneath our feet.
Exactly. Let's explain mechanically what a CTC actually is. Under traditional compliance, a company might have 30 days at the end of the month to gather its data, format it in Excel, and submit a tax filing.
The old reliable batch process.
Right. Under CTC mandates, which are rolling out in jurisdictions all over the world, that is no longer legal.
Nope.
Compliance submissions must be machine-generated, machine-validated, and machine-submitted via API in real time, meaning the millisecond an invoice is generated in your system, your server pings the government server to validate it.
It's instant.
An Excel spreadsheet is structurally incompatible with this reality. It is a batch processing, manual tool in a legal context that strictly mandates real-time automated execution.
Yeah. You can't run a macro in a millisecond API call.
Exactly. To me, this proves definitively that we must prioritize the architectural investment. The unified data layer isn't a nice-to-have. It is an existential structural necessity. If you don't have the architecture, you literally cannot legally trade in those jurisdictions.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that the advent of real-time machine-to-machine compliance actually proves my point?
How could it possibly prove your point?
While I completely acknowledge the urgency, the text is unambiguous. If you aren't solving this right now, you are already behind. But it makes the human investment exponentially more critical, not less. It creates what we might call the automation paradox.
The automation paradox? Explain the mechanism there. How does removing the human from the data submission process increase the need for human intervention?
Because when compliance happens in real time at the transaction level, mistakes happen in real time at the transaction level.
Ah, I see.
In the old world, you had 30 days for an analyst to notice a strange discrepancy in a spreadsheet, dig into the anomaly, realize someone coded an invoice wrong, and manually fix the ledger before the filing went out to the government.
The manual safety net.
Right. Under CTCs, that safety net is gone. The data goes straight from your ERP to the regulator instantly via API. This means your upstream data quality must be absolutely flawless from the second it is entered.
Right.
And more importantly, your human governance over the rule sets dictating that automated system must be extraordinarily sophisticated. The system executes the transaction instantly, but a highly trained human must set and govern the parameters of that execution.
Sure, but
without a massive human capability upgrade, CTCs are just a highly efficient way to report your errors to the government at the speed of light.
wow. Reporting errors to the government at the speed of light, that perfectly encapsulates the fear every CFO has right now.
It should keep them up at night.
But I would argue that your automation paradox actually validates the architecture-first approach.
Really?
Yes, because you literally cannot upgrade the human capability. You cannot weaponize your team's expertise to monitor those real-time parameters until you build the architecture that makes real-time data possible. The architecture, the orchestration layer, the APIs, is what provides the capacity for the human to act as a governor rather than a data entry clerk.
But capacity is not capability. That is the trap.
What do you mean?
Giving a finance team an extra 40 hours a month because they no longer have to manually reconcile accounts in Excel does not magically grant them the deeply technical skills required to govern a canonical data model or manage complex API exception rules in a continuous compliance platform.
Well, no, it takes training.
Exactly. You are displacing their traditional work without providing a safety net for their new required skill set. The failure is assuming that buying the technology solves the whole problem.
I don't think anyone who has actually gone through this thinks architecture is magic. I mean, it is unglamorous, difficult, intensely complex work. As we discussed, chart of accounts rationalization is excruciating.
It's painful.
But let's look at what the text fundamentally concludes. The strategic response to Excel dependence is an architectural diagnosis. You look at every single spreadsheet your team uses, and you map the gaps those spreadsheets are filling.
Right.
Then you design the structural solutions to fill them natively. Every Excel file is a map pointing directly to a place where your core systems are failing the business.
I agree with that.
Until an organization fully commits to the foundational triad, the canonical data, the orchestration, the compliance layer, Excel will remain an inevitable, unkillable workaround. You simply cannot train or govern your way out of a missing data layer. The root cause is structural, and therefore the primary cure must be structural.
And I maintain that the most elegant, perfectly mapped, phenomenally expensive architecture will shatter upon contact with reality if organizations underestimate the embedded logic and messy data realities that their human professionals currently manage in those spreadsheets.
The mud in the pipes?
Yes. This spreadsheet isn't just a map of broken systems. It is a repository of vital institutional survival mechanisms. If you rip out those manual mechanisms without deeply understanding the tacit knowledge they contain, and without simultaneously upgrading the data quality and human governance capabilities of your team, the new architecture will just be a faster way to fail.
Technology can lay down the high-speed tracks, but human capability and judgment are the only things keeping the train from derailing.
Well, it is a fascinating tension, and the stakes for getting it right are incredibly high. But I think there's a profound point of convergence here between our perspectives, drawn directly from the text.
Oh, we both agree fundamentally that Excel is not the enemy. It is a diagnostic instrument. And we both agree that simply migrating a process from a Microsoft spreadsheet into another purpose-built manual cloud tool, basically just buying a fancier spreadsheet, is a total waste of capital that solves absolutely nothing.
Completely agreed. A workaround wrapped in a slick new software interface is still just a workaround.
Which brings us right back to the lobby of that corporate headquarters. When you see the orange bucket catching the water, you now know you have two vital jobs. Yes, you have to do the heavy lifting of building a new roof, deploying the canonical architecture that stops the rain from getting in.
Right.
You also have to understand exactly what that water is, how it's flowing, and ensure the people inside the building have the expertise to govern the new structure once the bucket is gone. The spreadsheet is the symptom, the architecture is the cure, but the human being is the physician.
Perfectly said.
We will leave it there for you to consider. Look closely at the spreadsheets circulating in your own organization, not as annoying files to be deleted, but as vital clues pointing to the deeper structural and human needs of your enterprise.